Listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Brittany Kabinski and I want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m. so we will begin our presentation shortly. Today on Friday, June 22nd, we will have our presentation on the Southwest Ecodistrict Creating a National Showcase of Sustainability, given by Elizabeth Miller and Otto Condon. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box and we will be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of the sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible, as well as the National Capital Chapter for sponsoring today's event. As you can see, we have quite a few webcasts planned for the next few months. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcasts and register for your webcast of choice. We're also offering distance education webcasts to help you get your ethics or law credits. These webcasts are available to view at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive, and you can follow the instructions on how to log your distance education CM credits at the top of the web page. You can also follow us on Twitter at Planning Webcast or like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is Friday, June 22nd, and then select today's webcast, which is the Southwest Ecodistrict, Creating a National Showcase of Sustainability. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are also recording today's webcast and will be available along with a PDF of the presentation at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. And at this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today, Elizabeth Miller and Otto Condon. Elizabeth Miller, a senior urban planner with the National Capital Planning Commission, has over 25 years of public and private sector experience. She has managed some of the Commission's key planning initiatives, including the Urban Design and Security Plan, the National Capital Framework Plan, and the current Southwest Ecodistrict Plan. Since 2000, Miller has led teams that have been recipients of several national ASLA, APA, and AIA awards in urban planning and design. Prior to joining the Commission, Miller was the principal planner for Palm Beach County, Florida, and served in appointed positions on several boards and commissions. She holds a Master of Design Studies degree with a concentration in real estate development from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and a BA in landscape architecture from the University of Florida. Otto Condon, AICP, is an urban design principal with ZGF Architects, LLP, and has over 22 years of professional experience in architecture, urban design, and planning projects. He has been extensively involved in the development of plans and projects for downtowns, neighborhoods, housing, institutions, and transit in Boston, Portland, Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington. International design experience includes professional work in London and volunteer work in Nicaragua and Guatemala. Recent projects include the Southwest Ecodistrict Plan, the DC Streetcar Program Management, the Deanwood/Ward 7 Strategic Development Plan, and the Columbia Heights Public Realm Design in the district, and the Dickinson College Sustainable Campus Master Plan. Otto's academic background includes a Master of Architecture, Certificate in Urban Design from the University of Washington, Seattle, a Diplomado de Arquitectura Urbana from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City, and a Bachelor of Environmental Design from the University of Colorado Boulder. So I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker for the day, and we'll start the presentation.
Good afternoon. This is Elizabeth Miller, and Otto's here with me.
Hello, this is Otto Condon.
So thanks to everyone for joining us today to hear about the Southwest Ecodistrict and how we are working here in Washington to create a more sustainable future for a very challenging area within our community. I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what you'll be hearing today. I'm going to introduce the project and then provide an overview of the foundation of our work and give you a little bit of a backstory of how we have gone from vision to a plan with some very bold moves that has actually got a lot of community support, and we're well on our way, we hope, to moving towards implementation. So I'll talk a little bit about that planning process. and how we're actually taking this 110-acre area and turning it into a vibrant, highly sustainable, livable, well-connected community. And then, so many of you might be asking, and some of you may be familiar with what is an eco-district. It's a term that is becoming more commonly used. In fact, we have about 5 different initiatives taking place here in Washington, D.C. And I'll be so bold to say that ours is probably one of the most ambitious. But an eco-district is a comprehensive and forward-looking approach to urban sustainability and livability. And the premise is that we're planning development and infrastructure at a neighborhood or a district scale, which we believe can attain greater sustainability and financial results or an economic benefit than we can at planning at an individual building scale, which you know, in the recent past has been our focus and how we make buildings more sustainable, and now we're trying to move back towards that neighborhood scale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think now is the time to capitalize on the momentum to do this, and then Otto's going to talk about how this area will actually become a highly sustainable mixed-use community, and the results that we're going to be able to achieve. And then I'm going to wrap up a little bit about our cost-benefit analysis and the work that we're starting to do there, and then how we actually will look towards how we're looking towards implementation. And then we'll be happy to take anyone's questions to wrap up. So with that, I'm going to ask the advance slide to get us started. And just a kind of a quick overview, as I said, I was going to give a little bit of the backstory of the eco-district work. And this actually started back in 2005. There were 4 different planning initiatives going on within Washington in the Central City area. We had the District of Columbia. That's the area there shown in sort of the light peach color. They were looking at how to focus economic development activity, and where they were going to be concentrating their efforts to revitalize communities. The National Park Service was undertaking an ambitious plan on how to improve the National Mall, which is the area shown in green. And then the architect of the Capitol was actually doing a campus master plan. And so, and the areas in blue actually cover the area that the National Capital Planning Commission worked on, and how we were trying to improve the destinations and how we were trying to bring the idea of sort of that civic quality of the mall off of the mall into the city, but also to start infusing the vibrancy of the city and downtown into our civic core. And what was interesting is a lot of people in the very early days were confused about how all these different initiatives fit together. So the 4 planning agencies got together, all the project managers started talking, and we came up with this diagram that really started to kind of change the game. And it became a very clear tool on how these 4 different jurisdictions, both at the local and federal level, were working together, and really how it started to make sense. So the bubble areas actually show what we call our destination areas, areas that we all agreed we would focus on in trying to create new destinations or new communities. And then all of the lines there, you still see them, are how we actually make connections between those areas. So moving on. This actually is the monumental core. This kind of shows where our big moves are. And we focus on the areas surrounding the National Mall. We actually pulled together a task force of federal and local partners. There were about 12 that served on that. It was actually a steering committee. And they basically helped to set the direction for this overall vision. And as you all know, and doing what we do as planners, we looked at these areas surrounding the National Mall and started looking at the different systems. And here in D.C., particularly, we're looking at views and symbolic connections, our land use mix, transit, and the public realm. And we started to layer all of these to look at how we could create these great new destinations and connections within the monumental core. Next. And this is an illustrative plan of that. And I'm not going to really go in and talk much about this. But if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to our website. The plan is on our website. But the area we're going to be focusing on is the southwest rectangle, which is the area south of the mall. and between the National Mall and the Potomac River. This actually was deemed to be the cornerstone project of the Monumental Core Framework Plan because it's where we felt we could really achieve the greatest results. And quite frankly, it was also the area that needed the most help. So with that, just a little bit of background of how this area has transformed over the centuries. This was one of the first neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. Being on the Potomac River, it was part of the maritime industry and an important local port. And it also was near the Fort McNair, which was an important military base at the time. It had a very fine-grained fabric of dense row houses that was a mix of row houses, stores, shops. It was a really mixed-use community. And as the city started to grow and develop, this area really didn't get the attention it needed, and there's a lot of sanitary conditions. And by the 1930s or so, there was enough concern about this area that planners started looking at how to revitalize it. And of course, the Capitol, which you don't see on this map or this plan, just sits off. If we're looking west, the Capitol just sits off to our east. You can see the Washington Monument up there in the top right corner. But essentially what happened is this was during the era of urban renewal. The planners came in and basically raised about 400 acres of city fabric and displaced about 23,000 people, and essentially planned a community that looked much like this. And so in essence, what happened is they took that mixed-use community and they created the residential garden living areas to the south of the highway. The line going through the image is the southeast-southwest freeway, which we'll talk more about in a minute. The area to the north became basically an office park, predominantly of federal offices. This just gives you a sense of the land use mix. Within our study area, you'll see basically just commercial and office use. There are no residential uses. There's actually one hotel that is at LaFont Plaza. I don't know if we can try to show you where that is. I don't want to spend too much time doing that. You can see the residential to the south. Next. This is the character. You're actually looking at the Department of Energy, looking north towards the Smithsonian Castle. This was the first building of the Smithsonian Institution. It's a beautiful Romanesque building. And the Department of Energy was built in the 1970s. And so this area is characterized by very large roads, very large setbacks, super block buildings. Most of the buildings are elevated. There's no relationship to the street. And I know that probably every area of the country has a part of their downtown that has these kinds of conditions. So it's been a bit challenging on how we actually look to transform these areas into a walkable, livable community. Also going through our study area is a railroad that was actually built in the 1800s. This actually slices right through the community. Kind of gives you the character. Along this railroad, the buildings turn their back to it, and it kind of creates this very industrial place right in the shadow of the Capitol. In the top left, you can actually see the Capitol peeking over that elevated bridge. A portion of the avenue was actually decked in the 1990s. That's the lower left. And the Portals development was constructed. And this basically is really the only kind of accessible area from this corridor at this point in time. I should also mention that this is Maryland Avenue. So if you can picture the plan of Washington, Maryland Avenue is the sister street, in essence, of Pennsylvania Avenue, which runs between the Capitol and the White House. In this instance, Maryland Avenue is that link between the Capitol and the National Mall towards the Jefferson Memorial. Excuse us. This is a freeway that runs through our study area as well. It's about 10 to 12 lanes of freeway, plus there's another 5 or 6 access roads. Creates a tremendous barrier in the community. And because of having to get the streets in this area over the rail and the freeway, we have a lot of challenging level changes. And this just starts to give you a sense of some of the challenges that we're facing. So when you're down in this area of the city, it's very difficult to walk from point A to point B. And it's even confusing to drive. And this is a shot looking back from the south to the north, looking back towards the mall in the city. And I wanted to point this out because this gives you a context. You can see the Department of Energy that then crosses the 10th Street, which is that major spine that you see there in the foreground. The buildings around it are a mix of public and federal buildings, and this cul-de-sac actually was built a bit as an afterthought. When they were building the development to the north of the freeway, no one really thought about how to connect back down to the water and how to get over the freeway. So this cul-de-sac area was built, and Dan Kiley, who many of you may be familiar with, well-known landscape architect, was hired. Well, he was very young at the time. He was hired to do this plaza that shows the fountain down in the bottom right. And the image, the color image at the top, actually shows how most people get from that cul-de-sac plaza area down to the waterfront. It's literally what we call the sheep's path. It's a dirt path that you've got to maneuver down. So these are some of the challenges that we're trying to correct in this area. I should note that the Kiley Fountain is entering the point in time where it could be deemed as eligible for listing on the National Register. So this is one of the considerations that we're having to think about in our planning work. And then this is the buildings, kind of the primary buildings that sit within our study area. And you can see they're all of this mid-century modern, very large superblock buildings, as I said, elevated off the ground. The Wilbur Wright building that you see there in the top left has actually been deemed eligible for the National Register. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is on the National Register. And so as we started looking at our planning work, and this will become more significant in our conversation as Otto talks about our recommendations for this area, but we're having to straddle what is historically significant, what should we start to look at preserving, and what areas can we actually start to modify. And of course these buildings, because of their relationship and their urban forms and their architectural style, makes them very difficult to weave back into a more walkable mixed-use kind of neighborhood. And this is actually the Monumental Core plan. So we took all this information. This is the work that we did back in that was really the predecessor to the work we're going to talk to you, focusing with you today. But this is the Monumental Core Framework Plan that looked at these primary destination points and where we concentrated our recommendations. And I just wanted to point out one thing, just as a point of contrast, as you'll see in the bottom left, sort of our initial concept or the initial idea for 10th Street, which is that street that heads south between the Smithsonian Castle down towards that cul-de-sac. And when Otto gets into his presentation, you'll see how that vision has then been more refined and how that's going to contribute to a lot of our eco-district goals. Next. This is just a close-up of kind of an illustration of that. And one of the things I wanted to talk about here is when we did the framework plan back in between 2005 and 2009, we brought together all of our stakeholders and we started to really pull together a lot of good ideas that had been proposed by a lot of different planning efforts over time. So many of the ideas here came from different places, and there's some new ideas in this as well. But what we did is we kind of reinitiated that planning process to bring sort of the current decision makers up to speed and to help start to build a vision and consensus with those decision makers. And this was a very dense urban idea. We never necessarily expected that it would particularly look like this, but this is how we got started. Some of the kinds of things that one of the very important things that we did is really started to try to illustrate a feeling or a context of what we were trying to create to communicate the kinds of recommendations that we thought were important in transforming this area. And I will make a note that, or like to say that in the very early days of this work, not all of our steering committee members were fully supportive. They thought that our recommendations were a little too bold, perhaps too aggressive, and a lot of what actually went into our ultimate plan was very negotiated wording. So a lot of the recommendations, we did a lot of wordsmithing to get everyone very comfortable with these recommendations. And just for example, and one of the big recommendations that came out of this plan is that we redevelop the Department of Energy, which is the site that is shown here on the right, looking towards the Smithsonian Castle. So very different urban context. And so the questions came up, well, where's the Department of Energy going to go? How are you, are you displacing, these workers? And so a lot of our recommendations took care of those nuances. And the reason I bring that up is that that was really important in really getting their buy-in to this and allowing us to go to that next step that Otto's going to really focus on here in a few minutes. Next. This is just another area of our plan. So I just talked about the 10th Street corridor, which is that north-south corridor there. It's hard to describe without a pointer. You need to kind of point where that is, because we're going to be referring to this a lot. Oops.
Maybe not.
Sorry, technical difficulty. Anyhow, so that north-south street is called 10th Street. The diagonal street that goes from the northeast to southwest is Maryland Avenue. And that street is actually that rail corridor that I showed you a picture of a little bit ago. And you can see that rail corridor there in the bottom left. And so again, this is just some of the big vision ideas that we use to build our recommendations and to start to build some consensus around how we might transform this particular area of the city. And I really wanted to put this up because one of the most challenging areas within this plan is how we would actually deck Maryland Avenue to maintain rail service through this area, but also make it a pedestrian place. And the section here at the bottom is actually the park that is shown in the upper plan. And that's a very important reservation in Washington. It's actually the cross-axis of Maryland Avenue and Virginia Avenue, and on axis with the Washington Monument. However, if you were to stand in this park today, you wouldn't see the monument because the Department of Energy actually is blocking it. So this proposal kind of shows it's the kind of view corridor we might be able to recreate with this new planning work. So the Monumental Core Framework Plan, it was about a 4-year process to go through all the planning work, the public process, the consensus building that was necessary to get it approved. And it had 3 main goals. One was to protect the National Mall and to create new cultural destinations off the mall, but also to protect the federal office space, as well as create new places to work, live, and visit, and how we could actually transform the 10th Street and Maryland Avenue corridors into this vibrant mixed-use community. I would also like to point out just another part of the backstory here is that when we started this work, our intent was really to protect the National Mall and to find new cultural destinations. And as we got into the work, we realized that we really couldn't do that until we met those last 2 goals, which was also how we're going to protect the office space and how we're going to create a mixed-use community. So it turned in really to improving the settings for future museums and memorials that would be near the mall to more of a revitalization plan that would really create a true community. So a lot of the work that Otto's going to talk to you about came from this foundation, but another critical point in the process here that really helped us gain a lot of momentum was Executive Order 13514, which is Leadership in Environmental, Energy, and Economic Performance. This was an executive order signed by President Obama in 2009, and it basically was a transformative shift in how the government does our business. And it makes greenhouse gas emissions a priority for us and how we can reduce those gas emissions and really become a leader and to help to push that industry forward. This executive order can get very specific on the targets for energy, water, and waste reduction, and we use those targets as sort of as one of our bases to setting our goals within the eco-district. There were a couple of other important things that were going on. So in addition to the federal government and the President Obama's executive order, Congress was also looking at ways that the federal government can become more efficient. So we have these very aggressive sustainability targets that we're being asked to meet. We're being asked to create a much more efficient workplace. We're being asked to reduce our operating costs. And we need to start thinking about the future. A good number of senior federal employees are going to start to retire. We're going to lose a large part of our workforce, probably in the next 10 years or so. And we need to start attracting a new, modern, younger workforce, which, as we all know, works much differently. And so we're in the midst of making that transformative shift. And last, we also need to improve the conditions of the mall and to protect our cultural resources as the nation's capital. So that was those are sort of the main drivers that were happening on the federal side. But we also had some very important things happening in the private sector, and with the catalyst, actually the District of Columbia government was catalytic in helping to make happen. And so there's a lot of reinvestment going on in this part of the city. And actually our area that I've been talking to you about was becoming a barrier to that investment. So the image at the bottom of the slide actually shows a new development that is currently being planned, and we actually expect that they will break ground in 2013. If I get my numbers right here, I believe it's a $2 billion development and a billion square feet or something. It's a huge amount of square footage. Can't remember the number right off the top of my head. But this has got a lot of momentum, and they are currently well underway to making that waterfront development happen. We also have a couple of private properties within our study area that are also sinking in a significant amount of investment to improve the one hotel that's in our study area, but also to expand some of the private development within that 110-acre eco-district that we're going to be talking to you about. I should also say that, go back actually if you don't mind, let me show you one other thing. Another part of the backstory here is that we being the National Capital Planning Commission, have been trying to get a nationally significant museum to locate in this part of the city for a long time. And they just weren't interested because there was no there there. It was not a place that really anybody would want to go. And what's been interesting is as the waterfront development is starting to take off, but also as we're doing our work that we're going to be talking to you about here in just a minute, we're now actually getting interest from major museum and memorial sponsors, at least looking at this area and starting to come up with their own concepts of how they might actually put a national cultural destination within that kind of bleak mid-century modern landscape. So I kind of covered this before, but just to recap, and I'll start to begin to hand this over to Otto. So what is an eco-district? And here in D.C., as I said, we've got about 5 going on. One in our downtown area is looking primarily at energy amongst a large group of private office buildings. The District of Columbia is looking at doing an eco-district master plan for a formal federal campus that's going to be going private. And so what I'm trying to get at is that all these eco-districts have a little bit of a different definition. So this actually starts to set up the definition that we're using for our eco-district and what some of our main objectives are. And that's to capture, manage, and reuse energy and water and waste beyond a single building to a group of buildings, and to try to handle all of those resources within our eco-district or within our boundary. So we basically want to use energy, water, and reuse energy, water, and waste to make those resources most efficient within our study area. But we also recognize that it includes important transportation choices as well as a mix of use that will create a neighborhood. And in order to be a successful neighborhood, we need to have a connected system of parks, plazas, open spaces to make this walkable community. So a lot of our specific recommendations, our strategies, and guidelines that are contained within our plan actually go to try to meet these particular objectives. This is actually the study area I just wanted to mention here. The red boundary shows the area that the National Capital Planning Commission focused on with our task force. And I also would like to mention that after we finished the Monumental Core Framework Plan with that 12-member steering committee, we then formed a 17-member task force. And in that task force, focused on that area within the red boundary, but then the District of Columbia had a specific interest in the area within the orange boundary, which is the Maryland Avenue corridor. So essentially, this project, even though it's one plan, it actually had two very important components. And it actually established a very close and collaborative and cooperative working relationship between the federal government and the District of Columbia, which is not always the easiest thing to do, because sometimes we have competing needs. We just attended the Maryland Avenue plan was just before the City Council, actually yesterday, on Wednesday. So that plan is in the midst of obtaining council approval, and they're currently looking at how they might actually fund some of these improvements. And so this is our study area, what it looks like today. Talked a little bit about that already. It's about a 15-block area, 110 acres. About 60% is owned by the federal government, about 30% or so, actually 25, like 22 to 25% by the private sector, and then there's about 15 to 17% that is actually infrastructure. So infrastructure takes up an incredible amount of real estate within this area. So our mission is really to transform the 10th Street and Maryland Avenue corridors into this well-connected place where we can commemorate, live, work, and visit, but to do it in a way that showcases sustainability. And that's what we're going to be focusing on with you now. So next slide, please. Before I hand it over to Otto, just wanted to mention that we are in the midst of literally doing the final edits to our draft plan. This plan, you're actually getting a preview. This plan actually has not yet gone fully public. We're going to be releasing it. We're going to be taking it to our commission on July 12th and releasing it for public comment on July 12th. There'll be a 60-day public comment period before we then will incorporate those changes to wrap it up, to take it back before our commission for approval. Next. A lot of work has gone into this. In addition to the 17-member task force, we had about a 40-member working group of technical staff. We convened in a lot of working meetings, both very interactive and charrette-type formats, as well as, which is the top photo there, that's our working group at work, but also meeting with our task force representatives and the higher level decision makers throughout this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Otto, who's going to talk about how to achieve a highly sustainable mixed use. No, I'm not quite yet. I'm sorry. I've got a few more slides, and I'll turn it over. So now we're going to talk to you about how we're achieving this sustainable mixed use community. Just some background. Before we actually started looking at our strategies, we did a market study. Actually, the city actually helped pay for this market study, but we looked at the market within this area, and we used this study as a basis to help us set a baseline for what our use mix might be for a successful mixed-use community. We then focused in on the systems within this particular area. So we looked at our open space system and how we could connect these important public places, how we could create these new cultural destinations, and how this open space system and these cultural facilities would relate. We also looked at our land use mix, which I said before, which is basically a mono mix at this point. But we looked at where we would kind of focus our federal and cultural uses and where we would focus our mix of uses. I would like to note that this doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a private development in that federal cultural zone, but what we're trying to communicate is that within that zone, we want it to feel like it's part of that civic community, that it's part of that monumental core. It has an identity more like what people perceive as the nation's capital versus a more, maybe a little messier, more vibrant mixed-use area. We also did a couple of different transportation studies as background work. We did a pretty extensive study looking at all of the elevation changes within this area and how we would actually connect the street grid, physically how we could make vertical connections as well as horizontal connections. This was very important in basically eliminating potential development scenarios that just wouldn't be feasible. And then we also, once we came up with our development scenario, we did a broad conceptual transportation analysis, at least at this point in time, to give us a sense of what kind of additional automobile traffic we may generate versus what transit. One of the things I should mention is that this area of the city is probably one of the most transit-rich. It's got 4 metro lines that come into it. There's 70,000 employees that work within this area. And what's interesting is that the transit system is actually starting to operate at capacity. So one of our major objectives is to look at how we can expand the capacity and actually bring more commuters into this area. So these 2 diagrams start to show the street grid. So one of our main objectives was how we could revitalize this area to reconnect the street grid, basically kind of minimize those all those different vertical elevation challenges that we have so we could get better connectivity within the area. And then we also looked at how we would bring in all the transit to an important transit and intermodal hub within this area. And the other thing we looked at were the character of the streets. So in our guidelines start to set up strategies and recommendations on how we make sure that we start to blend the federal city with the local city in a way that respects both but also begins to integrate them. So we have civic streets, monumental streets that might feel more like the federal city, but also start to bring in a mix of use. But then we also have those streets that help the city function well, which are those, local city streets that bring commuters through, as well as the local neighborhood streets that support a lot of the functions that are needed to make these buildings viable. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Otto, who's going to talk about our sustainability strategies and recommendations.
Thank you, Elizabeth. To complement the design physical framework, we did identify the 4 areas for sustainability strategies, which you see on the screen are water, urban ecology, waste, and energy. Working with our consultant was Eric doing engineering for us, one of the charges of the plan was to make a business case. So to do for sustainability, to do that, we really needed to find out the metrics of all of our recommendations. So what you see here is a couple spreadsheets, but we basically did some conceptual modeling, first starting with all the existing information we had from square footage, the energy use for all the buildings, the population, the water use, all the waste and recycling that was done for the buildings. And then as we started to build scenarios, we could identify what the population increases were, the water use changes were, the energy use for the buildings, based on different recommendations for how the systems may be applied to rehab or for new construction. The first thing to talk about is the water. So if you take the study area, about 92.4 million gallons of water fall on the site. DC, stormwater management, is a critical issue. We actually, working with the EPA as one of the task force, they identified that the water that fell on the site did not need to go back into the Potomac, which said that we could actually use the 92.4 million gallons for to collect and to use for replacing potable water, since right now potable water is used for everything. That's also part of the executive order, was to complement that, to reuse all the rainfall from a 95 percentile event. In terms of the potable water, we were actually, right now it's about 18 gallons per square foot. As we looked at all the future development, our target was to hit 9 gallons per square foot. To do this, we were looking at collecting roof water, or collecting stormwater off the roof, collecting it on the ground, using flow-through planters to support better irrigation, and then also recycling water so that we could basically create a gray water system for the flushing of buildings and non-potable uses. One of the critical issues for doing stormwater collection at a district scale is that a lot of, well, current regulations don't really require that right-of-way collection is done by the district and individual properties is done by the properties, and combining the two isn't allowed. So it's one of the pilot recommendations that has come out of the plan that we can actually collect stormwater across properties to use for a district collection system. The image on the lower left is an idea to take advantage of, as Elizabeth had shown, the double tiered streets. There's actually room down there to do a cistern, and we've, as part of our modeling and costing, we've identified the size of the cistern that we can actually collect the water, the stormwater, which can then be used for buildings and for irrigation. So it doesn't just basically flush through down to the Potomac. Urban ecology, in looking at the water strategies, we wanted to use the stormwater so that it would actually help to create an environment on the street level that people can experience and that can actually help to reinforce the natural habitat. So the idea was, and I'll get to it later, is that maybe green roofs aren't the best use if we're trying to also do energy, but to actually bring the stormwater down to the ground, that will help to reduce the down effect. It'll help for the vegetation along the ground plane and really promote green infrastructure that creates a better place that people want to be, which right now, it's, as you've seen some of the photos, it's really pretty much a concrete wasteland. So for construction waste, as we're looking at all the new construction, the goal is to recycle 75%, and for building waste, right now it's about 30% in some cases, really to reduce all that, reduce the solid waste that goes to landfill by 80%. Our recommendations are really built on 3 tiers. We started looking at the building scale, which is really what you might sort of parallel with LEED measurements. And part of the eco-district is that it has to go beyond a simple building scale. So then we built up to a block scale and finally the district scale. In terms of waste, the diagram here shows that at the block scale, which is essentially, or what's illustrated is the north end of 10th Street, showing that each of the buildings can have a recyclable waste. Black water will go be collected. We did look at a black water system for the district, which can be pretty expensive, and as the district is now looking at an anaerobic digester, the District of Columbia down at the Blue Plains facility, one of our recommendations was to actually not try to handle black water within the district, but actually use the District of Columbia system. We are also looking at collecting the gray water for new construction when there's a dual pipe system, so that can be channeled into the cistern and then recycled and cleaned. Energy is probably the biggest strategy for the district. Fortunately, there's currently a cogeneration plant in the area which burns natural gas. As part of the target was to hit a zero net energy district as measured in carbon. Currently, the cogen plant burns natural gas. So to down the road, I think 2030, to actually hit net zero carbon, it will need to be a decarbonized system, which there are some technologies so it's not burning either natural gas. It can be things we're still investigating. As we look at the buildings, the building improvements, as you saw in some of those photos, they're 1970s buildings. Their skins are pretty inefficient. A lot of them are basically failing. So our strategy looked at, and we did modeling, was what if we rehab the buildings lightly, which is basically all the systems, versus doing a full rehab of a building, and then comparing that to new development. By doing light rehab buildings, which is upgrading the mechanical systems, improving the lighting, improving insulation, and addressing the plug loads for all the equipment, we could probably get a 47% decrease in energy usage. If we fully rehab the buildings, which is basically ripping them down to the structure, or a new construction, we would basically have a 72% decrease in energy usage. As we look, that was for the buildings. For the district, we also, and for the block scale, we've conceptually modeled how much solar thermal we may use, our rooftops, how much solar PV we would use on all the rooftops. And if you notice that one image, one of the front images where it's rather green on the ground, but there's a lot of photovoltaics, that was one of the discussions was, you know, to properly use the water was to bring it down to the ground for landscape, but then to use the roofs as much as possible for photovoltaics. So it's one of the balances that we had to address. Also looking at ground source heat in the areas where, like north of the rail yards, it's actually, most of the development is on grade, so we can start to look at some geothermal opportunities. And then using the district system for four-pipe heating and cooling. This image actually shows the solid red line going from, we're number 4, the cogen plant. Currently, all the federal buildings, the Smithsonian, some of the district buildings are on the system plant, the district plant, the cogen plant. Another issue too that will need to be addressed is to make that the district system the most efficient is to balance the daytime uses of office with residential and hotel uses. Currently, by congressional rule, we cannot connect private buildings to the cogen plant and that system, so that is another recommendation that we have to kind of think outside the box to allow private sector, non-office development to connect to the cogen plant to actually make it the most economically efficient system possible. We're also, actually one of the other systems, was looking at sewer mining, which is essentially ground source heat, is to, on the southern end of the district, to absorb the heat from sewer water, which comes out of the buildings at, you know, anywhere from room temperature 72 degrees, so we can actually absorb the heat off of that to provide heat for the buildings. It's another technology that's used in France and around the world. It's been pretty popular now in Vancouver, BC, and it's something that it's time for it to do in the U.S. So in terms of, so, you know, when you start a plan like this, I think the RFP often says you have to do so many scenarios. Like you figure you're going to do 3 scenarios. Well, as we were modeling our various strategies, it wasn't an idea of, it wasn't, you know, is it scenario 1, scenario 2, or scenario 3? It was actually a more holistic strategy that evolved, that it was multiple approaches in order to achieve all the goals we were trying to hit. So this is a sequence going through the strategies by the building scale on what would need to be done to achieve all the targets for both environmental and creating a sense of place with population and mix of uses. So here, all the light gray are private buildings. The darker gray, we're outside the district. The darker gray are all the federal buildings within the district. So the first step is, next one, is identifying which buildings should be lightly rehab versus full rehab. Now the light rehab buildings were those which we thought there may be a different future for them. So you wouldn't want to spend all the money basically ripping them down to the structure, but you would want to make some improvements so that for the next 10+ years, possibly, you are saving money. The blue buildings, such as the HUD building, which is that sort of H building, I guess, which is deemed historic, we would go to, it's currently going through a full rehab. The building to the north of that, which is, there's the 2 FAA buildings. Can you point to those? That's Orville, the FAA building, and the other building to the right of it is Wilbur. And so part of the recommendations when we looked at the development capacity was we were not going to decrease, we were going to maintain the square footage for federal buildings, but we were going to look at them to make them more efficient. So I think currently some of the buildings have about 330+ square feet per employee. New GSA standards reduce that to anywhere from 125 to 200+ square feet per employee. So the idea is that if we make some buildings more efficient, we can create some surplus properties but still maintain the existing workforce population. And that's why in that particular case, Orville is blue because we think that building will probably stay, but if you do the right things with that building, you could surplus Wilbur, which is to the right, which provides other opportunities. So the next image shows repurposing. So that's the case of if you basically have the FAA staff in Orville, the Wilbur site becomes an opportunity for a new civic structure that's shown in purple. It's next to the Independence, across from the Air and Space Museum, next to the future Eisenhower Memorial. So it's a real opportunity for creating a new civic or federal facility there. The building to the south of that is the GSA headquarters, another opportunity because it's next to Reservation 113 to create a potential mixed-use building. And then that long purple building is the Postal Service, and we've identified it as for repurposing for a couple of reasons. First, because it's right next to 10th, and something really needs to happen to that frontage to help to activate 10th. And as it's the Postal Service, there may be opportunities for it to be more efficiently repurposed. The next is showing infill, which are sites, it's in the light blue, sites that are currently vacant that provide an opportunity to bring in a mix of uses, whether it be residential, hotel, or more cultural facilities. The buildings to the north of Maryland we've identified to be more residential and hotel with some cultural. And then to the south on the Banneker Overlook is an opportunity for the more museum and the more, cultural facilities, as Elizabeth had mentioned. Finally, some of the bigger moves are the redevelopment, what we call redevelopment, and you'll see now that the Department of Energy site has been redeveloped. We've looked at the existing square footage for the Department of Energy. We can basically use up half the site that it currently takes to replace the square footage, which would then provide additional space for more office, more residential, more cultural facilities. And then what's really a long-term idea is how to cap the freeway with, and we anticipate that'll probably be private sector development, hotels, residential or offices, to create that connection, a seamless connection across the freeway to from the mall down to the waterfront. So in numbers, what does this mean? Essentially, right now there's about 10 million square feet of development, about 8 million of office space. We can get another 3 million square feet of office space. There's about 4 to 6 sites for cultural development, another 8 acres of improved parks, and then reconnecting the street grid. This is just a view looking down from the castle to the waterfront. And so what are the energy, water, and waste results? With the development and all the strategies, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 51%. We plan to use all the water, all the rainwater within the site. We'll reduce the potable water use by 70% and increase the amount of waste diverted to landfills from 35 to 80%. These are just this is the current view from the VRE site, and some images of what it might look like as it gets redeveloped. The next one. Here you see that the DOE site has been redeveloped to create the view to the Washington Monument. The idea that the transit facility could be redeveloped, we're showing grass tracks because every strategy to capture stormwater would be used, creating canopy, which would be photovoltaics in order to provide energy and also some protection from the heat of the summer in DC. The next one. Here's another view from Reservation 113 looking up to the Capitol, existing view. Here's a revitalized or a redeveloped Reservation 113 Park, which would have extensive native landscaping and stormwater management. You see the streetcars coming in to the left. It becomes the transit hub for connecting the existing regional train system, the metro system, future streetcar, future buses, while creating that strong connection back to the Capitol. Here's a view from the waterfront. Currently, as you look up, you see the sort of unused lawn and the Banneker Overlook, the Dan Kiley landscape. And the idea is, next one, that this would really become a high-performance demonstration extension of the mall. Really, is instead of as you're down on Main Avenue, you can look here, and the green will pull you up into 10th Street, so that you really feel like you're connected back to the National Mall. We're showing an overlook. We're showing multimodal connections along the street for bikes improvements, and the images to the left are the future developments along the riverfront. And again, trying to think of all the views, and here showing the connection, the visual connection back to the Washington Monument. So there's a lot of recommendations. To make it more manageable, we have identified 4 focus areas, which are the Independence Quarter, shown in yellow, the 10th Street Banneker in red, the freeway, which is the black rectangle, and then the Maryland 7th Street sort of transit complex in green. And when the plan is released, there'll be a lot more detail on what each one of those areas, in terms of recommendations for projects, who's supposed to partner and be responsible for certain aspects, and so it becomes more manageable to actually implement. So I want to talk a little bit about 10th Street. As you've seen several photos, it is really a concrete wasteland that if you try to walk there in the summer in DC, you might not make it because of heat stroke from just walking about 3 blocks. So in one of our first strategies was to think about, as 10th Street becomes redeveloped, it's really an opportunity for infill and landscape interventions at within the street right away, for stormwater management, that the buildings adjacent to the properties have to really embrace a vertical and green approach, and then the infills themselves may be either commemorative or they may be part of the landscape. So these are just some examples we've been using to illustrate the ideas that might be developed. Currently, these are 3 just preliminary approaches or concepts that we've developed. The next phase is to develop them further. And these were done in order to identify how much area we may be able to capture for stormwater management, what the sense of the space might be in terms of, currently the right-of-way is about 225 feet, or building face to building face is about 225 feet. If we narrow it down to a more typical DC right-of-way, which is about 110 feet, what does that get us in terms of land development, and what's the resulting public space? So these are just 3 preliminary ideas, actually 4, looking at the creation of nodes, which is in purple and yellow, of plazas or infill features, and then also how the roadway and the tree canopy might interplay to create a sense of the appropriate monumental street. So the next one here is, you'll see the dark gray is where the existing building faces are. The lighter gray, where it says redevelop, this is where it's reducing from 225 down to about 140 foot right away to create the view back to the castle. This is the more, this is the boulevard approach of creating a more central spine for pedestrians and activity, and then a uniform tree canopy with carriageways on both sides of the central median. The next one is, perhaps the roadway should be down the middle of the street to really create a view back to the castle. Some of the discussions were, is it better to have cars have the view, or should you put the pedestrian space down the center of the street? Here, the trees are then more condensed canopy on each side of the street would be created. The next one is maybe we shift the approach for the cars and make it an asymmetrical section to really create that strong central pedestrian spine, and then have the development a little bit asymmetric to the right. And so here, again, is how it currently exists, and you see the Department of Energy building spanning over the road. And this is an illustration of all the strategies that may be utilized in order to reinforce the street. We're showing vertical greens along the buildings, stormwater tree wells with seating, LED lighting, multimodal or bike lanes on the street with maintaining the view back to the castle. And this is I'll say this one is in progress. It was really trying to identify all the strategies, and we're still looking on how to make this a little bit more monumental in scale and feel. So And so that, I want to turn it back over to Elizabeth to talk about the business case.
So that was a kind of a snapshot of sort of the big ideas that are coming through with our kind of land use, transportation, and environmental strategies. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of kind of where we are heading towards implementation. We have actually done a conceptual cost analysis or cost benefits analysis for this area, but I'll just say right up front, we've got a lot more work to do, and we're actually in the process of doing that. So I don't have all the answers at this point in time, but we definitely have a feel and a grasp on what our costs and benefits are going to start to look like. So we actually, and just to kind of give an overview of how we structured this, we looked at 3 types of investment costs. And then to go to the next slide, it might help illustrate this a bit. So the kinds of investment costs we're looking at include sustainability costs, much of what Otto just talked to you about, that really relates to buildings and utilities. We also looked at open space and streetscapes, as well as the real estate and new development, because there's a lot of opportunity costs here as well. And in looking at that, we also started to look at the benefits. And there's a number of benefits, and all of this can get quite complex. But we've got, some of them are summed up here, such as revenues from the sale to essentially the federal government. If we use our buildings more efficiently, we can actually maybe dispose of some of our excess land, and still have revenue from the sale of excess land for private development, which would hopefully help us reinvest in this area. We've also got cost savings, of course, from energy, water, and waste efficiencies. Just the benefits of creating a sustainable mixed-use neighborhood and the kinds of revenues that would bring in for the city, not only in tax revenues, but economic development, employment, and all of those associated benefits. And then there's this other category of sort of intrinsic benefits that's really difficult to put a price on. And those are things such as enhanced opportunity for cultural destinations, creating a new museum for the nation's capital. It might be, cleaner, some of the economic or some of the environmental intrinsic benefits are, cleaner rivers, reducing our carbon footprint. And of course, we can always put a cost to these things, but it becomes very challenging that we're kind of putting those kinds of costs in our intrinsic category, which means that it's really invaluable, that these things are very much worth doing. And looking at that, what we've determined is that over time, and we're looking at about a 25-year planning horizon here. So in making some of these, we're looking at the sustainability investments really are probably the big ticket item at this point in time. However, one of the things, and the reason we're continuing to do this cost-benefit work, is that we also realize that even if we didn't do the recommendations that Otto described to you, there's a lot of just basic building maintenance, modernization that would have to go into the existing building facilities, in those existing facilities. So we're starting to drill down a little bit more to look at what kind of money we would need to spend anyway versus how much, if we can spend a little bit more money, we might get a bigger bang for our buck, so to speak. And then, of course, that will translate into some of the benefits that I just mentioned. I would also note, you'll see in our plan when it comes out, we've also found that in making some of these streets, this open space and streetscape improvements, we were provided some really good case studies. And just for a point of interest, some of the studies show that in New York City's Bryant Park, property values around that park actually increased by 50% once those improvements were made. Millennium Park in Chicago showed a boost of property values of 25%. And in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they put a lot of effort into their park system, and they found that their rent and premiums increased by 15%. We've also been looking at how our costs might increase over time. New stormwater requirements are going to be increasing our stormwater management costs. So we're starting to kind of project what those costs are going to be into the future and weigh that against the the cost of doing the kind of improvements we want to do as compared to the savings that we think that we can actually ultimately generate. And then lastly, the other interesting point is as we've done this work, I think we started, of course, sometimes the federal government might move a little slower than the private sector. And we started really some of this sustainability planning several years ago, but the private sector gets in there and they tend to catch up very quickly. That waterfront development that we showed you to the south of our project called the Wharf, that sits there on the river, they've actually incorporated some very similar recommendations. They've actually taken some of our recommendations and incorporated into their planning work. And they're going to be capturing all of their water, stormwater runoff and reusing it for a cogeneration plant that they're going to be building just for their development. And we've talked to them in some detail about the benefits of that and what's it's very difficult to pencil out the numbers, particularly when you're doing development from the ground up, to kind of break out how those costs are. But they emphatically said to us, it is worth every penny of the amount of money it's going to cost them to construct those systems and what they're going to get back in return. So we're confident as we continue to proceed with our planning work and our studies that the private sector is out there finding value in this, that's going to help translate to the federal government finding value as well. And then next slide. Just to kind of wrap it up, any project of this magnitude, again, it's going to take an effort of everyone to make it happen. And so we've looked at one of the things Otto mentioned in our recommendations. We started to identify the various partnerships that could occur to make some of these moves. And in many instances, we've identified that the federal government actually has the ability to make some of the things that we need to do to happen. And then the District of Columbia has the authority to make some of these improvements. And then we also know that the private sector is very interested in what we're doing and are watching very closely because I think they see the benefit and how these recommendations will come together to transform this place, you know, to the benefit of the private developers and private landowners. That with that, there's a few things that we've identified that are really going to take, for lack of a better word, a Herculean effort and having to come together to do a couple of things in unison, and that is managing and paying for this district-wide infrastructure, particularly our water and energy infrastructure that Otto talked to you about, as well as building these new streets that we've also shown you. There's also, we haven't focused on this in this particular presentation, but we've mentioned it, that there's an incredible opportunity for this intermodal hub and to improve that system. And that's going to take a special partnership between probably federal and local and private sector to make happen, as well as just coordinating this overall activity. So we're looking at a couple of different avenues. We're looking at sort of an improvement district type structure that would bring all these partners to the table, give them a voice, but also a stake in making this happen. We're also looking at the special legislation that might create the kind of structure that we're going to need to make this happen. But I guess just to wrap up here, what I'm pleased to say is that we've gone from working on the Monumental Core Framework Plan, where maybe our vision was a little bold for the time, but within really a very short time period of just a few 2 or 3 years, we've got a lot of federal and local interest in actually trying to make these things happen. But we also realize that we have a big road ahead of us to make it occur. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and we're going to open it up for your questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Elizabeth and Otto. So we've had some questions come in. The first one comes in from Richard. Were metrics or standards established that specified what percentage of the area must be either open space or pervious pavement or green vegetated areas? You can have open space, but too much of it can be hardscape, i.e. pavement, and not enough actual planned areas or flowers or trees or shrubs.
In our modeling, we made various percentage assumptions for all the horizontal surfaces in terms of the proportion of hardscape versus landscape, and then also looked at, depending on what the landscape was, the potential capture of stormwater if it was a flow-through planner or such. So we do have it, and we actually had a kind of range of numbers for that, and that's part of the next phase is when we'll look at the design of 10th Street in more detail is where we'll really get into the sort of numbers of, percentage of hard versus soft and what the impacts are for, or influences are for stormwater management.
And just to add to that, the city is actually doing some pretty aggressive sustainability policies, and they're looking at what they're calling a green area ratio of, I believe, 35%. And that actually includes roofs, green roofs, green walls, and pervious surface on the ground, or green area on the ground. And we're actually looking to try to exceed that standard as well, because we are going to be an eco-district.
Okay, great. And this question comes in also from Richard. If you could just go over quickly, what was the sewer mining heat and why is it called ground source heat?
Well, sewer mining is essentially if you're like pulling the water, like all the sewer water from the buildings, and it's coming out at essentially room temperature. You can basically absorb the heat off of the pipes and use that. And so I just compared it to ground source in that it's a sense of you're basically pulling heat off of a sort of below grade asset. And so it's comparable to like how you would basically how you pull heat out of the earth for geothermal and such.
All right, and this question comes in from Sean. It sounds like the presenters established goals and then designed to attempt to achieve the goals. What were the goals based on?
Well, a lot of the goals, particularly the environmental goals, came out of that executive order that we mentioned, or at least that sets the baseline for those goals. And in many instances, we actually found that we can exceed them in this area. With regard to the land use goals and the mix of use, we really used the market study to kind of help guide us as a baseline. And so what we did is we looked at the overall development capacity within the city, or where the city, what kind of planned development was underway, what was under construction, what was projected, to look at, as far as residential absorption throughout the city, how would this area compare? Or how could this area contribute to that, or at what time frame would residential maybe start to be desirable here? And we found, and for just using that as an example, we found two things. One is that with what the city has in the pipeline, that probably, and until this area, until we can actually transform this area with improved open space and improved streets and that kind of pedestrian infrastructure, it's going to be hard to attract residential. So one of the recommendations in the plan is that some of this mixed use might start out being a hotel or two. That would bring, because we have a great demand for more hotels in the city. So that kind of brings in sort of a type of residential component. And then as we can make these improvements and we can start to bring in more of the residential, 24-hour residential community. We also looked at retail and how much retail was happening in the surrounding area versus what our population was within this area and what we felt we could support. So I guess in essence, those goals and those targets were set based on the market study as a base, but also the executive order and how we might be able to achieve. And we also used LEAD. I mean, we spent quite a bit of time up front trying to come up with targets and metrics, and we kind of got into this point where we're like in a spiral. It's a very, you could spend a lot of time doing that, and we kind of got to the point where we felt like we had sort of a solid objective that we felt that we could meet, and then we kind of stopped looking at targets and metrics and said, okay, here's what our goals and targets and metrics are. Let's start actually doing the planning work and the modeling work to see how we can meet those. And then actually what we found in many cases, we could exceed them. I don't know if that answers your question. But
Okay. Our next question comes in from Amanda. This appears to have been a very expensive planning process. Can you speak a bit to the amount of money allocated to completing the comprehensive or constituent elements of the efforts you've discussed?
Actually, that's a good question, and we haven't spent a huge amount of money. Our consultant is like sitting here staring at me, probably spent a lot less money than they would like to have spent. But we did pull together a partnership, and I would say to date, between 4 different agencies, we've probably spent $500,000, maybe $500,000. Not all of that's been spent yet, but we've got that in the pipeline to spend. And that did a lot of the initial modeling work, the initial planning work, the market study, those components. So it's, the other thing I should mention is that both the district staff and the federal government staff, we don't solely rely upon our consultants for everything. They definitely have provided the heavy lift on this work. They've provided the expertise when it comes to the strategies, particularly in the area of environmental strategies, as well as how to create these mixed-use communities. But staff has been there working right alongside them to try to help relieve their burden on them to do this on a budget.
All right. And this is sort of related. Are you going related to the funding, how that's going to work, and are you implementing in phases, and what will be the ultimate outcome 5 to 10 years from now?
Essentially, we've identified in the plan both near-term and long-term types of activities. In fact, Otto mentioned some of the planning work that's currently underway. We've identified one of the things that we need to do is improve the streetscape along 10th Street. And we don't want to wait for other big moves to happen to get that to occur, because we really need to start moving people between the mall and the waterfront. So that's one of our first phases, and we're actually going to kick off that work probably here early this fall. And we partnered with the District of Columbia to start that process. Some of the other kind of first phase work is starting to really look at how we can address some of these federal laws that prevent us from doing some of the things we want to do. So we're going to have to get some legislative authority to move forward, particularly with like how we move water across property lines. We're studying currently the General Services Administration is doing some more detailed studies on the cogen plant and how that might be able to expand capacity. So short-term goal is to get this getting down towards more of an engineering studies that are needed so that we can figure out what our costs are to do these improvements over the long run. But I will say that there's active planning going on right now with Maryland Avenue. We're meeting in the field next week with the Department of Transportation to talk about what kind of studies are going to be necessary to do the NEPA work that's going to be required to actually try to make those kind of things happen. And the other thing I should mention is that when we do this kind of work, we're trying not to say, we want it to be very flexible. So we don't see this as, some things of course have to happen before something else can occur, but a lot of these recommendations that you'll see in our plan when it comes out can actually occur kind of at an individual basis. And for example, the Department of Energy could redevelop before we build the Maryland Avenue. May not be ideal, but it could happen. Maryland Avenue could be developed before we actually do Department of Energy. So we try not to put it out into a sequence, but to break it up into manageable projects that could occur and to understand the relationships among projects, so that this plan really becomes a document that guides decisions and coordinates very complex projects and decisions as we go forward.
All right, and our next question, so Victoria would like to know, would you mind sharing who your marketing and other consultants are?
Well, ZGF was our prime consultant, and they've, again, done the biggest heavy lift on a lot of this work. And your subs were?
Arup Engineering, New York, out of New York, was our sustainable engineering consultant. We had Kittleson being our transportation consultant, and HRNA was our economic and feasibility analyst. They're out of New York and DC.
And the city also used AECOM. I think they did both the marketing study as well as some of the transportation work along the Maryland Avenue corridor. And we actually used Parsons Brinkerhoff to do some of our initial kind of study of the transportation infrastructure and how we can make those vertical and horizontal connections.
Great, thanks. So our next question comes in from Greg. Private development proposals tend to act as a mechanism to draw attention to an area. Did the waterfront project kickstart the whole thing?
I don't think they kick-started it. I mean, the waterfront development is definitely a catalyst now that it's going to, that's taken form and taken shape. But this work, particularly within the eco-district, is very much a federal initiative because it's highly owned by the federal government. And so a lot of, I think, what this has done is provided some predictability and maybe some momentum for some of the private developers to be willing to make more investment in this area. Now, I will say that, like LaFont Plaza, which is in the image that you're seeing before you, it's the two buildings in the foreground that have a darker skin with a kind of a tan building bridging them. That's a private developer, and they've come in. And of course, with the waterfront development and just the overall development that's occurring in this part of the city, they're right now building 2 new infill buildings that you don't see in this particular drawing to expand their complex. So it's a little bit of, I think, the synergy working back and forth between definitely the private sector and their ability to make investment and their ability to get it done quickly with kind of the overall vision that we're putting forth with the eco-district.
All right. Our next question comes in from Richard. Are wind and solar energy mechanisms planned to be integrated into the building development and rehab? Also, were the height of the buildings considered with human scaling and also the sun ray altitudes and angles, or were those a criteria? And another question, is geothermal heating a practical consideration for heating and cooling the buildings in your area, or is that cost prohibitive?
Well, the first question about solar was, if you're looking at the rendering right now, you'll see a lot of solar panels. All the blue on the roofs, and we also have a solar canopy over the freeway. In the areas where we couldn't cap it, we thought doing a PV canopy over the freeway would help to mitigate some of the impacts and also produce energy. The solar, we calculate, will probably produce about 7% of the electrical energy for the district itself. We looked at wind, but wind in itself in the district of Columbia, this geographic area, doesn't really pencil out. We could see it being in some areas as a demonstration project because it is the intent was to really make this area be a model for sustainability. So, down 10th Street, maybe there's an opportunity for some wind turbines, vertical and horizontal, to basically demonstrate power. Geothermal, we did, like north of Maryland, there's opportunities for using that. So that was part of the calculation for energy reduction, was to incorporate geothermal with the other building systems. In terms of building heights, so there's a little thing called a building height restriction in the district where it can only, basically buildings can only be, or generally 20 feet taller than the width of the street. So, which throughout the district, the maximum is anywhere from 110 to 160, with one exception being 160 feet Pennsylvania Avenue. Or, yeah, so generally 110 to 130. So on all these schemes, you know, depending on like the width of 10th Street, we basically maintained about 130-foot height, and also looked at stepping of that. We didn't propose any skyscrapers. That's the question.
Okay. Our next question, this is also about the waterfront from Stan. If all of the waterfront development is private, how will the NCPC ensure public access to the water after the great investment at the roundabout, etc.?
Hi, Stan. In this particular area, you'll notice from this image that the 10th Street right now terminates in that cul-de-sac. The proposal is to actually do some type of stair ramp type of connection. In fact, one of our next steps is we're going to be partnering with the waterfront developer and the National Park Service to actually design and get that connection built. That'll probably be one of the first things that the general public will see occur in this area. So there's a connection in that way, but there's also through that kind of signature landscape that you see there off to the southeast, there would be another series of walks and paths that could get you down from the hill to the waterfront. And we actually, it's an important point, we worked very, very closely with the developer and their architects to make sure that we retained the view shed and the view corridor between the Kylie Fountain overlook area and the waterfront. And they were very cooperative, and you'll note in this, you can see sort of the white buildings ghosted up along the waterfront. That's the private development. We have about a 100-foot view corridor and plaza at the foot of that stair that comes from the hill down to the waterfront that provides an important view corridor. And the developers also worked with us to model their buildings off to the east. You really can't see it in this drawing, but to create some view corridors through some of their residential towers and down some of their alleys that would give people who arrive at the terminus of 10th Street a sense that they've arrived at the waterfront.
All right. Let's see. So this is also a comment from Stan. The view shed is great, but will the public be restricted from putting their feet on the ground near the water?
I'm not sure. I believe. I mean, the plans that I've seen for that's the private development area, so it's not anything we have jurisdiction over. But I've seen some of their initial plans, and the proposal is to actually bring a lot of really dynamic piers, pedestrian piers, out as fingers from that waterfront development into the channel there. And I would assume that there might be locations where you can get in and feel the water, but I'm not positive.
All right, great, thanks. Well, I think that will finish up our question and answer session for today. So thank you, Elizabeth and Otto, for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on our plan, it will be out. The draft plan will be public on July the 12th. You can go to www.ncpc.gov to see to get a copy of that plan. And we would love your feedback. We're still taking public comment. We're still refining our work. So if you would like to provide any feedback to us, please do so. There will be you can email me. My information is provided here. There will also be I'm sure, a link with the plan where you can email in your comments as well.
All right, great, thanks. So the email addresses are listed here for anybody who wants to follow up with Elizabeth or Otto. And for those of the attendees who are still with us, and I'm going to go over how to log your CM credits for attending today's event in just a moment. So that will conclude today's session, and thank you again, Elizabeth and Otto.
Thank you.
All right. Well, for those of you who are still with us, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM and select today's date, which is Friday, June 22nd, and select today's webcast, which is the Southwest Ecodistrict Creating a National Showcase of Sustainability. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits, and we are also recording today's session, and you'll find the recording along with a PDF of the presentation at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. So this does conclude today's session. I want to thank everyone again for attending.